All right, so this recent study that I did was talking to parents of kids who have a disability, and why did I do this? So when you have a kid, and this is for any parent, there's a lot of things you have to learn about how to raise your child. Every parent faces that. There's a lot of information that you get. Sometimes when you're expecting a baby, there's books out there that I think there's a when you're expecting, like here are things, we want to reduce that uncertainty and kind of know what we're going to do. We've had experience, most people have parents, or we've seen other people who have been parents and we learned things from that. You might have babysat as you were as a younger person. And so we know some things about what it is to raise a kid. You hear things from your parents or grandparents. You might have siblings who've had kids, friends, and so on, that we kind of observe, and we use that information to try to raise our child and make decisions about that. When your child has a disability, you have all of that, just like you would with any other kid, but there's a whole nother level of information that you are really inundated with. And so one of the things that I remember the day after Isaac was born, when we were in the hospital, there was like a line of people that came and talked to his mom and me about all kinds of things, about what Down syndrome was. Isaac also has a heart condition that he's had 3 heart surgeries for. So I've learned all kinds of stuff about a heart. I didn't know what any of that meant when he was first born. That was very scary and, terrifying. But it was just like an information dump that whole day. And you're already kind of stunned and kind of shocked, that you got this diagnosis about your child. You're not in a place where you can easily absorb that information. And that's one of the key things of why I wanted to talk to parents about how do we make things a little bit easier for parents to make sense of all of this information that is being communicated to them, so that they can make good decisions, that they can care for their child, and that they can handle, the emotional aspects. Because this information is, we like to think information is like this objective sort of thing that there's no emotions attached to it. And that's totally not true. When you hear a doctor come and say, we think your child may have Down syndrome. And by the way, it looks like they have a heart condition. You don't hear anything after that. You're just thinking, oh my God, can I do this? Are they gonna, I remember my first thoughts, he's got a heart condition. That was actually more important than him having Down syndrome. Is he gonna live? Those are your initial thoughts. So you don't really hear any of the explanations. And this is one of the challenges in health communication, is because there are a lot of emotions attached to that information, is how do you get it across in a way that people can steadily absorb it, that they can make sense of it, that they understand it. Because as a parent, you're going to be asked to make all kinds of decisions, not only when they're a little baby, but throughout, all their years as they're growing up. And then sometimes when they're adults too, depending on their ability and level of independence, you'll continue to do that. So that was really the why I wanted to do a study of this, is how to make that experience a little bit easier. Because, my personal experience, it was pretty rough. It was tough, and I'm not unusual. Lots of parents go through that same kind of experience. Even the way the diagnosis was delivered to us was quite challenging. I wasn't there. I had left to go home. So his mom did not have me there when they told her that. And the doctor basically said, didn't you know? And so it was very accusatory. And so it was a very negative experience. And that is not unusual. And there's been a fair amount of research that has looked about how do you deliver a diagnosis? And it really should be, congratulations, you have a beautiful baby. We might have some concerns here. There's different approaches that you can be able to do that. And that's really been kind of the goal of my research. Whitney, you can go ahead and go to the next slide. So I interviewed, so here's kind of why I want to help. When you have a child with a disability, you learn lots of medical things. When they start going to school, there's all kinds of things in the education system in terms of individual education plans, potentially alternative diplomas, things that prepare for their transition to an adulthood, which that's where I'm kind of at now, because Isaac's 15. So a lot of what we're looking to is what happens after high school for him. And then just the social interactions become really important to us, because our children, human beings always have some uncertainty when there's differences. And sometimes we're afraid of differences. And so it becomes important that we have some extra hurdles. Like, we want people to know our child as a person, as a human being who's just has same kinds of interests as you. And so developing social networks becomes really, really important as well. But some of this information is hard to understand, it's hard to process, and it often can be emotionally overwhelming. So what I did was I had a series of focus groups with parents of children with a variety of disabilities. And I won't go into how that study was done, but it was, again, just kind of an interview sort of format. And from the results of it, I identified a number of themes within 3 areas: sources that people get information from, strategies they use to get information, and then kind of the emotions that they feel. And then ultimately, what I'm looking at is how do we make sense of that information in a way that can be effective. So go ahead to the next slide, Whitney. So first thing was looking at sources, and what I heard from many of the parents is their number one source is other parents of kids that have the same sorts of disabilities. And that is better than doing, going online, which we do that too, but that you can trust people better, and that they've had experiences that are somewhat similar, and they can give you advice about where to go for certain things. So for example, here in Northern Kentucky, there's a group called KIDS, Kentuckians Interested in Down Syndrome, and that's a parent group. And we have a Facebook page that, we'll throw out a question like, hey, this is going on with my kid. Does anyone know where we can go? Or can we get recommendations about doctors to go through? Or I'm also in a couple of other groups related to heart things, and people will post pictures like after heart surgery, like, does this look normal? If there's some kind of like something's kind of swollen or something like that. And so other parents become really, really important, not only for information, but also emotional support. So that was one thing, number one. Number two is a lot of the families had experts already who were like, they might already have a doctor, like a brother or a cousin or somebody who's a doctor already or who's a teacher. And so a lot of times they would go to those family experts for information as well. And those 2 sources were probably more important than the actual professionals. We still rely on them, the doctors and the teachers and so on. Obviously, that's really important. And then the final kind of source that came out was the different support organizations. So Cincinnati is really fortunate to have the Down Syndrome Association of Greater Cincinnati. It's one of the best Down syndrome organizations in the entire country. Tomorrow's the Buddy Walk, which will be virtual this year, but we have, I think, the largest Buddy Walk in the entire country. About 10,000 people typically participate each year, and they raise over $500,000. So very fortunate to be here, to have that kind of support organization. Not every disability has that. In fact, I'm familiar with the support organization for autism, which more people have autism than Down syndrome, but it's not nearly as organized as the Down Syndrome Association. And part of that is the parents. The parents started it, the Down Syndrome Association started back in the early 1980s. A lot of strong advocates who really pushed that and helped to develop that as an organization. And so that also is really, really critical. We can go to the next slide, and I'll talk a little bit about strategies. So how do parents go about figuring out and making sense of information? What strategies they use to get information? Part of it is observation. Again, what other parents are going through, reading things that you see that are getting posted. That's a little less active, but you're reading through those support groups, and then that's a way that you kind of absorb. Certainly asking direct questions. Internet searches are still a big piece of it, but even that behavior, and that's something I want to study more, changes over time, because sometimes we avoid information because it's hard and we don't want to know it. And so that's not always the best to go that route necessarily. And then one thing that really came across is parents become very strong advocates for their children. And then through your efforts of advocating for them, you end up learning things, even if you're not an expert and you don't always know what to advocate for. And so sometimes one example that I'll give about that is definitely in interactions with Isaac's doctors. We usually say, oh, the doctor says do this, and you just do it. His mom and I have gotten much better at questioning some of the things. And so, for example, he just got diagnosed with Crohn's disease, and they immediately wanted to move to these injections. And his Crohn's isn't quite as bad as they thought initially. And so we said, well, are there other options? And so he's actually on another medication right now that doesn't involve injections, it's pills, which is easier to give to him. I'm not sure that would have happened if we hadn't asked and really kind of said, we think the shots are going to be a little too hard to do for him. And again, that's something that you figure out at time. You're advocating, you don't even really know you're advocating, but you end up learning things as a result of that. And that was something I heard from a lot of parents in terms of their strategies of seeking out information. And then the last area dealt, is it clicking? Then what are some of the emotions that are attached? Because this is something that I found really important. Again, information is just not this abstract thing. There are real feelings and emotions that are tied to it. And so several things that I heard from parents, especially like when they got the initial diagnosis, they found themselves kind of just in a haze or a fog, and they really weren't in a place where they could listen. And so that's important for doctors to understand when they're giving people information. They got to give them time to have that emotional processing before they start saying, you need to do this, you need to do that, because it's going to affect how treatment is complied with. If they're not hearing you because they're so overwhelmed or they're just in a fog about the information, they aren't going to know what to do. And then often, yeah, this overwhelming, some frustration sometimes, especially as we became more of an advocate, you know, and we're running into barriers. But then on the kind of positive side, a lot more focus on staying in the moment and really enjoying life one day at a time and not thinking very far ahead. And I think especially during the pandemic, that's become important for everyone because we don't know what the future is going to be. Have a lot more joy over small things that your child is doing every day. So it's like, there wasn't a meltdown today. That is excellent, you know, and you feel like you take a lot more joy and becoming very, very protective. And those were themes that I heard a lot in terms of the emotions associated with information. So those were some of the things that I found. And then in the last slide about the study, then what are strategies that we kind of use to make sense of information? What you kind of find is really, when we're faced with things that we're uncertain about, we're uncomfortable with that. And that's a basic thing you learn in communication theory is, you know, how do we reduce uncertainty? And that goes across all sorts of things. But one of the strategies we often use is like, I got to find something that I've gone through before that's kind of like this, because that's going to not only inform me about how to handle it now, but also can give you some comfort about this. Like I got through that before, that was kind of tough. There's some similarities with this. Okay, I can do it again. That seems extremely important. The second piece then, and this is part of why we want those parent networks, we want to be able to connect to other people who have gone through the same thing. Again, that gives us information, but it also gives us that emotional support to get through those experiences and to make sense of what we're doing so we can make decisions. Those help to reduce uncertainty, but then there's a certain piece that you learn to kind of accept and cope with that there's going to be all this uncertainty, that some of it's never going to quite go away, and we can never really predict the future, and none of us can. But you become a little bit more accepting and coping with that more effectively as a result of kind of doing these sense-making strategies. So these are things that I want to be able to help parents be able to do a little bit better and help us to do, you know, to not only be more emotionally healthy, but also to be more effective in terms of helping to raise our children so that they can have successful and fulfilling lives. And that's really what the study was about.